orphan boy, hundreds of us were put on trains, shipped out west to help farmers with field work and any livestock that needed tending to. Now, I was born in Germany in 1854 and moved to America when I was 14. I lived in the New York area with relatives for a few years before starting off on my own. Now, my parents either could not afford for me or had died, but I was put on the orphan train and sent west to be farmed out. Before I left New York, though, I used to push newspapers just to make a couple dimes. Extra, extra! Read all about it. The cry of the newsboys is well remembered, even if the newsboys have not survived. Now, newspapers would publish extra special or extra editions after big news events like a war, an assassination, an election, or even a trial verdict. The newsboys would then shout out the top news, followed by, read all about it. Now, that orphan train I mentioned earlier, let me tell you a bit of its history. Now, the very first orphan train came in September of 1854, carrying 46 homeless children from New York. Now, some of these children were adopted by loving families, but others were not so lucky. And these children, this was back before there were government programs to take care of children when parents couldn't. And some were put in children's homes or orphanages where they grew up in institution. Now, some of these were very, very well run, but others were a disaster. Now, this all changed with the Social Security Act of 1935, but from 1854 till 1935, over 200,000 of the orphan children were sent west on the trains, and some of them are buried right here in this very graveyard. Now, I remember my first job here in Mason City. I worked as a farmhand for the likes of Dwight and Herbert Palmer. Oh, there was too much work to do though. All of those chores twice a day, and the work was dirty, very dirty. I was always stepping in something I did not want to. Those cornfields, they went on forever, and I was always afraid I was going to get lost. And then some farmhands would get injured, and Dr. Stella Mason, the first female doctor in Mason City, would have to take care of us. Oh, now, Miss Maggie Cook came to be my bride in 1879, and together we had 4 wonderful children. But poor Maggie Cook, oh, she was a beauty that was taken from me far too soon, at the young age of 48. Well, anyways, I had enough of the farm life, and I went and worked for the Milwaukee Roundhouse in Mason City, doing all sorts of jobs to keep these trains running. After that, I got into cigar making. I worked for, Terry and Wagner, Birchers and Fitzsimmons and Domick and Rake, all cigar makers in the early Mason City days. After that, I moved to Peoria, Illinois for 11 years and worked in a cigar factory there, before coming back to Mason City and starting my own cigar company right at 616 South Federal Avenue. Oh, those wonderful smelling cigars. Some of my favorites were Booster and Service cigars. Why, a cigar smoker could puff on one of these for at least an hour. And I was quite well known among the Mason City cigar factories. And why, even some very famous people smoked cigars. President Ulysses S. Grant, Groucho Marx, George Burns, and Mark Twain, to name a few. Well, I remember much that happened while I lived here in Mason City. Well, I remember when John Dillinger robbed the First National Bank, and when Charles Lindbergh came for the dedication of the Mason City Airport, and why I was even here in 1936 for the very first North Iowa Band Festival parade. Why, that was 75 years ago, and I remember there was a musically talented young boy by the name of Meredith Wilson, who happens to be buried right in this very graveyard as well. My funeral was held in St. Joseph's Catholic Church in 1944, and this grave became my final resting place. Thank you for visiting today. Please come again.
Very nice. well-known Stanton Hotel. It was down by the Milwaukee Depot in South Pennsylvania. I was born in Warren County, New Jersey, and when I was but 4 years old, I was the youngest of 6 children. Our family moved to Iowa by train. We came to Plymouth, and we had a farm that was just quite near Plymouth, and that's where I grew up. I went to country schools, and I also went to school in Plymouth. At that time, you could take a test and get a teacher's license, and so I did that. And I taught in some of the country schools around Plymouth. I was the youngest of the family, so it was my place to stay home with the folks and take care of them after they left the farm and moved into town. And at that time I would have been called an old maid school teacher, but of course now I would be a career woman. John Stanton was a very kind man, and may his soul rest. His first wife was Beezy Stanton. May her soul rest in peace too, but I don't know how she could with a name like Beezy. But the first one in that family to die and to be buried here was Beezy's sister, Elizabeth Russell Herdner. And she died when she was only 23. And she left 2 little children, a boy and a girl. So Beezy and John took care of those children. And Beezy died only 7 years later, so John continued to take care of the children. And the girl married and moved to Omaha, and the boy, Russell, after his mother's maiden name, moved to Buenos Aires, Argentina. Heaven only knows where he's buried. When we were first married, we lived in the hotel. And one of the attractions of the hotel was my parrot, Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy was a beautiful parrot, and he had a large vocabulary, most of it perfectly polite words, and he was quite a favorite of patrons who came to the hotel. If someone had been there previously and came back, they always asked, "How is Teddy?" He was a real favorite. For some time, people asked if we were going to have children, but of course I was nearly 40 when we married, so we never had children of our own. But we had a lot of nieces and nephews, and they always stopped around, so we stayed in touch with young people. And I think we may have had a little part of matchmaking, because I hired my niece Marguerite to help me in the dining room, and John hired his nephew, John Nayland, to help him with the bookkeeping. And what do you know? Those two young people got married, and they raised 8 Naylands, and most of them live right around here. The name is spelled the same forward and backward, kind of their badge of honor. I belonged to several organizations. One was, I was a charter member of the auxiliary of the Brotherhood of Railroad Trainmen. That's quite a mouthful. My brother was an engineer on the railroad. My nephew was an engineer on the Milwaukee line. And so I was always interested in trains. And of course, many of our patrons at the hotel were trainmen. So that stood me in good stead to have that emblem up there. Auxiliary, charter member of the auxiliary. In those days, to go any place of any distance, it was best to go by train. From Plymouth to Mason City, we always went by train. And sometimes over to Clear Lake even. And once, I went down to Cedar Falls to look at the normal school down there, the teachers' college. So train ride was just a wonderful way to get around. Well, as I say, John was a very good businessman. His hotel was well respected. It had comfortable rooms, and its location was wonderful because it was right across from the Milwaukee Depot. People could just step off the train and walk across the street, and they were home. Of course, there were other hotels in town. The Hampton, the Northwestern, and that Park Inn that they're making such a fuss about. But they were a dozen blocks away from the depot, and people would have to hire a livery wagon, to take them and their luggage up to one of those hotels. So ours was very popular and well attended. We had good beds, cotton-filled mattresses on good, strong woven wire, not those old straw-filled tick held up on rope beds. In those older hotels, we wouldn't have cared to be in that situation at all. So we made a very good living, and I could see when I first married John that there were some improvements that needed to be made about the hotel, and so I dressed up the dining room because I wanted to attract the finer people, not so many of the rough sort. And so I ordered linen tablecloths and nice silverware and nice china. John could afford it. He didn't object. But one thing I objected to was his cigar smoking. It was disgusting. It smelled disgusting. And the ashes dropping on the carpet were disgusting. And those old squashed cigar butts were disgusting. And so I made an agreement with him that if he would put the same amount of money in a cigar box for me, every time he bought cigars, that would satisfy me. And so he agreed to that. And sometime later, I don't remember just how long, but I asked him if he'd like to go for a little ride with me, and we rode up to that little gray house right over that very house. And I said, this is the house that I bought with the money that you put in the cigar box. I've rented it out. There's a young couple living there, and they pay rent every month, and it'll be a nice little income for us. Well, you should have seen John's face. He was just dumbfounded. And from that day on, he didn't put any more money into cigars. He put it into real estate, and he bought property all over Mason City. Thank you.
Peter Gilligan, born 1856, also County Down Island.
We were married in 1864. I was 26 years old at the time. Being good Catholics, the good Lord blessed us with 7 beautiful children. We had 3 bonny sons, Leo, Patrick, and brother Peter.
That's right. 4 darling daughters. We had Catherine, we called Catherine. Mary Ellen, Veronica, we called her Vera, and baby Rose. 3 of our children were born in Ireland.
When we first moved to Mason City, there was one hospital here. It was a Story Hospital located across from St. John's Episcopal Church in Mason City. But of course, my own children were all born at home by midwife. And a second hospital opened in Mason City in 1915, and that's what.
Well, back to why we left. Life was very hard in Ireland. We were under British rule, but we wanted to be under home rule, create our own parliament. So we tried to do that, but the British didn't want us to do that. So home rule was defeated in 1866.
All that takes
It just gets me upset.
Let's talk about the family some more. When we left Ireland, our baby Rose, the second daughter, she was just at the infant at the time. We got a passage on a ship to the Americas. We knew it would be a hard 2 to 3 months. We didn't want to risk our health, maybe a very life. It was a very hard day, the day I had to leave her in the care of the
Leave her people. Well, anyways, when we got to the homeland, which Baby Lowe's, we boarded a ship in the Allen Mine, 1891. They led us to some wooden stairs leading down to a part of the ship they called steerage.
Can you believe it? It was where they kept the animals. Oh, we were down there with the cattle. Maybe that's why they called it steerage for the cattle. I don't know. It was very dark. The only light was from the stairwell coming down. Oh, of course we had to care for the animals, with feeding and the watering and such. And the children loved it. They loved the sheep and the lambs, loved the cows and all. And they did give us food and water for ourselves, but we had to make do with whatever we could for the bedding. So the sheep kept the children warm as well. And the goat. We had a goat. Cherry milk with us. It was wonderful. And the times on the ship were difficult. The storms across the Atlantic was a very, very hard traveling. Fortunately, we had many other families to share our times with us, and there were good times as well, and we shared much joy with many families that traveled to America with us.
Well, back to Baby Rose. As you can see, when we left with our two oldest children. Baby Rose, just a baby. The trip was not safe for her, so we left her with my parents. But when we got to the homeland, we planned to bring her with us eventually. I wrote back asking maybe perhaps age 5 would be good. One of our parents would have to accompany on the trip, so they suggested maybe age 10 would be better. There were so many logical reasons.
Finally, when she was 18 and she boarded a ship, come over to America and reunited with her family. We look so forward to seeing her then.
Yes, and when she did arrive, she didn't know where we lived, so she contacted the radio station to get a hold of us. By the time Patrick put the message, our son, and got to the radio, she was already gone. She didn't leave any sort of contact or forward information, so we never got a hold of her. We tried desperately for many years, but to no avail.
She'll always be in the heart. Moving on with the rest of our story. When we got to Boston in the United States, we boarded a train going west. Our final destination was unclear. I hope so big in our new country. We got to the Midwest. Going straight until the Boston, reminding us of how we're still alive.
Well, when we first got here, we moved to a place called Pingley, and then Cruston, and then Clearfield, and finally a few years later we finally ended up here in Mason City. Now, I had no trouble finding a job. I worked as a laborer and burner for the brick and tile company. It was a very large industry back then. We had 9 brick and tile companies right here in Mason City. And this city produced more brick and tile than any city in the world. In fact, it was very difficult work, very hard. I worked 10-hour days for only $75. It was very hard. We had many strikes for better working conditions and better wages. And, in order to supplement my income, since I was making a little bit of that, I decided to grow garden in my yard. So we delivered food to the local grocery store to make an extra penny. Now one time, or a couple of times actually, had a few extra pennies to buy the paper. The Globe Gazette was around back then, and I read about a famous architect coming down, Frank Lloyd Wright. He built the Dr. Stockman House, and he designed a hotel and bank. So happy it's back to its original state now, just 101 years later. And, well, 1932 I passed on. It was a good life. I passed on right here next to my wife, Catherine, and a few of my children over here. Veronica, the oldest one, and Patrick, the oldest son.
Our son Leo cared for me after me teacher passed on. Leo was a good son. He worked for the Milwaukee Railroad right here in Mason City. He was a clerk in Milwaukee. Of course, I passed on my own love of antiques and flowers to my children. One of Leo's hobbies was actually buying and selling of antiques. Sometimes it made it rather difficult walking through the house with all the collecting that he did, you know. And at any rate, we loved Clear Lake so much, and I loved to go swimming in Clear Lake with the girls. They'd come to visit. The granddaughter, Eunice, would come, as well as my other daughters, Catherine and Mary Ellen, and we had such good times here, such good family times together. Most of the time, Mason City was a quiet place back then. Not a lot of excitement, but there was the time that the John Dillinger gang came. There was a bit of excitement there, I can tell you. They had guns and they took hostages. Ah, it was very, very difficult for us thinking of having public enemy number one right here in Mason City. But fortunately, we survived that along with the Depression in the 30s.
I didn't survive the Depression.
Aye, Peter left.
That in 1932.
Aye, that's true. I passed on in 1944, and my final resting place right here next to my husband Peter, and our children as well. Thanks to the generosity of our granddaughter Eunice, she's made the beautiful improvements here that remind us so much of our beloved homeland and as well as Ireland, and made for a beautiful, peaceful place for our final resting place.
Years prior to 1937, I left this area of Iowa with not very much to my name besides a chip on my shoulder, a small bag of clothes. Throughout time, I've watched this area develop quite a lot. When my family first moved here from the east, Mason City was nothing much besides a fledgling village with less than 700 residents. And over time, I've watched it grow to nearly 40 times that size. When my family first moved here, there was very few storefronts lining the streets. Now you can obtain almost anything you need to. I was born in New York in 1846, the son of John Chilson Sr. and Matilda Rector Chilson. Life for the Chilson families in the 1850s was a very rough time. There was so much poverty, rampant crime, gang extortion, corrupt politicians, house of ill repute, and drunkenness and gambling. Our family lived in an old brewery, a building that was converted to an apartment house. The floors were partitioned into small flats rented to the poor and seedy characters. Each room had whole families, cooking, eating, and sleeping in one room. It was a ghastly sight with squalid living conditions. Crime flourished, so our family packed up and headed west, settling in Lake Township of Cerro Gordo County. Along on this journey, I had my mother and my father, and also I had 5 siblings. Amos, Jerome, Alonzo, and my 2 younger brothers, Delfonso and John Jr. Delfonso, who is buried right behind me. I also had one sister who had priorly moved to Wisconsin, who, through marriage, was the aunt of May Hanford McNider. Out of all of my siblings, 3 of us were involved in the Civil War. Jerome, Alonzo, and myself. On the 27th of July, 1863, I went to Clear Lake and enlisted to be part of the War of the Rebellion in the 4th Independent Light Artillery of Iowa. We were under the leadership of Captain Philip H. Good. In November 1863, we organized in Davenport, Iowa, to head to battle for the Union forces. We first went out with General Sully on 22nd of February 1864, and then our battalion set up part of the Guard of New Orleans in the Red River Campaign. Succeeding the Red River Campaign, we marched to Thibodaux, where we remained until we were mustered out onto the 14th of July, 1865. Though the troop never fought in any battles, we were considered well-equipped and well-organized by our peers. I moved back to Clear Lake in 1866 for a year before heading out on myself to start a journey by myself, all alone. One that took me on many adventures through my long life. I became employed by Barlow and Sanders on the Great Northern Stage Line, traveling with goods all across the Midwest. I've seen the bison disappear from this area, no longer a familiar sight to many, but I remember them like they were just here yesterday. I followed that with a successful stint with the Pony Express in the Dakotas, traveling 50 miles per day, every day. Following that, I became a stagecoach driver, exposing myself to unsettled lands, foreign territories, and unfamiliar sights west in what is presently Utah. Not a day passed without a new sense of the world around me and new understanding of the territories. The Indians, as you know, in this territory, were taken over and pushed out of these lands, and I've seen it. I've been through the harshness of the desert, hauling freight the developing lands in the southwest lacking water and many needed supplies. The railroad brought many trains to Mason City in 1869. While you know the population tripled in size with the arrival of trains in the area, growing from 795 in 1869 to 2,510 in 1880. Trains began to haul many of the folks and goods that used to be transported by the stagecoaches that I once drove. I've been up and down the back roads, the dirt trails of this country's heart. I've seen sweat and tears, blood and bones. I've met many a legend, Buffalo Bill, just to name one. Over the years, things have come and gone, and I've seen a lot of things over my long life. I died on the 4th of January 1939 at the age of 94 years old. Thank you for listening to my story. May your journey bring adventure to your life like it has to mine.
However mean your life is, meet it and live it. Do not shun it and call it hard names. My name is Minnie Melson, the first wife of builder and self-made architect Joshua Melson. Early life for me in Hobart, Indiana was hard. My family was poor. No two ways about it. We were poor. There was conflict in our family. And because of that, as soon as I was able, meaning when I finished my formal education, which at that time meant at the 8th grade for most women, I moved to Mason City. My family felt, however, that it was very important, even when things were rough, to get as much education as possible. Mason City was a growing town at that time in 1875. The Civil War had ended 10 years previous. The official census count in 1861 had been 940 people living in the county, up from just 8 the census before. The prairie stretched on forever. The grasses were 2 to 4 feet tall. Birds and wildlife teeming on the prairie. Underneath those tall prairie grasses, they said that the topsoil was 8 feet deep. Back in 1869, the railroad came to Mason City, and then the Brick and Tile Company began in 1892, adding fuel to the growth spurt in the area. Teaching school in the Mason City schools was the perfect job for me. It was determined that I had the mental equipment and the stamp of character to teach. This was mentioned in my obituary. In reference to my continuing involvement in education, teaching was my life for many years. Following my marriage to my first husband, I could no longer teach. You see, married women could not work. Our marriage lasted only 1 year, however. He was killed in a tragic accident. Being a widow then, I was able to return to the classroom. Like Thoreau says, however mean your life is, meet it and live it. I met my trials head on, and I loved every minute of it. Joshua Melson, my second husband, was 4 years my junior. No, I was not a cougar. Joshua was very quiet and reserved. He had a reputation for being an honest man and a forward thinker. Joshua and 2 other architects of Mason City started the Rock Crest Project. in the early 1900s with the purchase of 22 acres on the southeast side of Willow Creek, right up along the creek and on the top of the bluff. The area is now called Rock Glen. Joshua advertised that the area was a 10-minute walk to the post office and a beautiful drive downtown. The first home was supposed to be ours, and it was. The house would merge with nature. Thoreau once again wrote in Walden, "Sit long enough in some attractive spot in the woods, that all its inhabitants may exhibit themselves to you by turns." That is how it was in my home. The length of time it took me to do the dishes depended on the number of squirrels on the windowsill that I needed to feed. Joshua built our home for me to view nature, and he certainly succeeded. We had an amazing home. It was clean, it was simple, bringing out the best of nature, ever so classic. We had a castle. When my early life was difficult, I learned the value of friendship and the importance of continuing education. Society events were of no interest to me. However, welcoming others into my home for study was very important. Never in my younger years would I dream of being a leading citizen of the community. But that's what my obituary called me, a leading citizen. Perhaps it was the women's study groups I attended and supported. In 1899, there were 100 study groups in Mason City. These were united under the umbrella of the Federation of Women's Clubs. Women could attend the Monday Club and study all kinds of things such as literature, science, history, philosophy, and psychology. There was the Equal Suffrage Club, of course, working for women to have the right to vote. My participation in the women's suffrage movement contributed to my social reform work. In my obituary, the author referred to me as a social reformer. As a Christian, I believed that being a Christian should be shown through my actions. Thus, I was a charter member and on the board of directors of the YMCA. In January 1915, however, my health began to deteriorate. The doctors Joshua called in could do nothing for me. My dear friend Mrs. Stinnerhauer accompanied me to the sanitarium in Colfax. I suffered an attack of apoplexy, which today's terms is a stroke. She found me unconscious and immediately sent word to Joshua. I died before he could reach my bedside. Joshua designed this beautiful mausoleum for us, although his second wife is also buried here. In the Prairie School tradition, the building is long and low, hugging the earth. The planters bring nature right up to the walls. Even the colors of the stone blend right into the earth. My final resting place, another gift from Joshua, is also clean, simple, bringing out the best of nature, ever so classic. This is now my castle.
But you can call me Burr. I had the honor of being sheriff in Cerro County. First, a little bit about my background. I was born on March 23rd in 1841 in Ohio, the middle son of 5 boys. As I reached the age of 18, I had the desire to learn about the West, and it drove me to leave my home and my family. So I went 765 miles to what is now called Mesa City. Back then it had fewer than 8 log cabins. In 1859, Mesa City was a small, struggling village. The government had sold the land for $1.25 an acre. On April 12, 1861, the Civil War began. The total population of Cerro Gordo County was 940 people. In July of 1861, 6 volunteers left to fight the Civil War. Within the next 2 years, additional 86 men were furnished, and a total of 125 men went to fight the war. 24 of these did not return. I left town in 1862 to join the 11th Illinois Cavalry to fight for the Union Army. I was at the siege of Vicksburg, Mississippi. There's a statue in Central Park that's honoring the Civil War soldiers. My father died in 1848 in Ohio, and so by 1864, my brothers eventually relocated in Mesa City. All of my brothers fought in the Civil War and lived or spent time in Mesa City. My brother Horace built a notable local building on the corner of North Federal and 2nd Northwest. It is now called the Kirk Apartments. On your way home, go look at that fine building. It's still standing today. After 3 years at war, I returned to Mesa City. The first railroad tracks came through Mesa City in 1869. The Milwaukee Railroad had a tremendous impact on bringing people and businesses to this town. In 1870, the census showed that we had 1,800 people. 10 years later, in 1880, we had 2,500 people in Mesa City. In December of 1872, I married Miss Mary Eddy. We raised one son, Lyle, who became commissioner of Mesa City. He died in November 1915 at the age of 42 years old. I was sheriff from 1885 until 1891, and there was no jail in this town, so we had to use my home to keep the prisoners. In 1902, I had the opportunity to be appointed a bailiff in the Iowa Supreme Court, so my wife and I moved to the eldest position until I passed away. Funeral services were held April 25th at the home of J.G. Melson. The Melsons are buried right over there. My wife Mary and son Lyle preceded me in death. Survivors were my younger brothers Horace and Isaac of Mesa City, along with my oldest brother William, who lived in Fertile at the time, and he lived to be 103 years old. 20 presidents of the United States served during my lifetime, starting with William Harrison and ending with Woodrow Wilson. I believe the good streets of Mesa City carry our presidents' names. During my lifetime, there was a wonderful inventions included the automobile, the gas range, skyscraper, the telephone, and even the light bulb. World War I began in Europe in 1914. 19 states entered the Union of the United States while I was alive. Hardships and privations were a way of life and had to be endured. Neighbors were kind and helpful, and there was a spirit of good cheer. It was a wonderful adventure. I had lived long and well. Thank you for coming today.
One's kind of obvious. But I also was a crack shot, and I could chuck something off a fence post faster than you would believe. I'd demonstrate today, but the sheriff down there doesn't want me to. Just have to believe. Anyway, my stone. And you can tell some things about me from that. Oh, here's Hattie Hearn Williams. Hattie was my wife. And, here I am, and here's Mamie Williams. Mamie was my second wife. I lost Hattie in 1893. And sad for a while, but Mamie was Hattie's sister. And we knew each other pretty well, so it just made sense for us to live together, and it worked very well. We lived together for quite a number of years. other side of the stone here says Kern. Well, that was their maiden names, so that's why we're here. I was born in 1860, and my family moved here in an area you now call Hanlontown. Lived there for a while and then to Mason City. And life wasn't too easy on the prairies. 1860, this was still pretty rough territory. We had a nice house for a farmhouse, but it was a little drafty. Wouldn't be odd for me to wake up with snow on my face in the morning. We'd have the cook stove in the kitchen and fireplace, but there were some cold times. But life was pretty good for a kid in those days. First thing I really remember, and probably all of you have maybe a first memory, when I was 5 years old, 1865, President Lincoln was shot. And that was quite an event. I've got a little information, a journal written by a guy named A.W.G. Morse, lived near Iowa City. And he'd report things in his journal. This is just some excerpts from it. It says, Saturday, 15 April 1865, cool and cloudy. Edwin, John Owen, and I went to Iowa City. The report came that the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, was assassinated. I bought a new stove for $38. But then a couple days later, he says, Monday, 17 April 1865. It rained all afternoon very hard. The death of President Lincoln was confirmed. Seems that a most horrible conspiracy against the lives of the President, Secretary Seward, and others had been formed, but the scoundrels did not succeed in their plan of wholesale assassination. But enough was accomplished to drape the North in deep mourning. I remember that. It stated that the name of the murderer is Booth, a tragedian. The last tragedy that he will enact, I hope, will be to dance on air. Well, it really did have an effect on all of us that lived in the North, the free states. I remember that well. As I was growing up, I lived on a farm. I got to know how to work with horses. And as the land expanded, people started farming this area. And it was not unusual for a family to move from Ohio to Illinois, live a few years there, get the ground going and sell it, move to Iowa, where there was more land, more promise. This wasn't the end. A lot of people would move from here to Nebraska or out west to California. Well, I got the wanderlust, and by the time I was able, I would go west and buy horses. And the horses I'd buy in California, in the Northwest Territories, I could buy a horse for $1, $2. These were wild horses that people had gathered up and sold to us. And we'd bring them back to the Midwest, and I could make $30, $40, $50 a good horse. So it was a good business, and not the safest business in the world, but I made pretty good money. And I'd pack up my saddlebags on my horse, ride west. My saddlebags would be packed with silver coins. At that time, the Indians, the Native Americans in California and the Northwest Territories, they didn't want any of that stamped money from the government. They wanted good gold and silver. So that's another reason that I learned to use this thing, because I was carrying quite a bit of money and I had to protect myself. Well, I did that for quite a while, several years, made pretty good money, and then I found out about a tribe that lived in the Northwest. that area now. You think of it as, Seattle, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana. I fairly rarely got to the coast, but Montana, let's say. And this Indian tribe was called the Nez Perce. And they were the only ones that would capture wild horses. They'd look at the horses, how they behaved, how they looked, what muscular structure they had, and then they would raise horses. They didn't just want to sell them. They made the best of it. They would breed horses. And the horses they bred were the fastest. They had the best muscle structure, and they were very popular when I brought them back. I could sell those horses at a premium, so I did. Well, pretty soon I got a little tired of that back and forth trip and all kinds of weather, so I decided I'd settle down. I met Patty, and we settled down in Mason City, Iowa, and had a good life. Some of the things going on then in Mason City were, of course, the railroads. Mason City became a center for the railroads. We had both north and south, east and west roads here, and became a real going place. Later years, I remember when Mr. Decker bought the old wheat packing plant, and all of a sudden, within a few years, it was 10 times the size that it was. So we were having good times. I was active in forming one of the first volunteer fire departments in Mason City. And I was active in that fire department for 20 years. And we saw a lot of big fires. Buildings weren't built quite the same then. Everybody was using kerosene and gas light, so it wasn't unusual to have a fire. I got interested in sport shooting and got to be known as a real crack shot. I mentioned that before. And I would teach that skill. So I did that as well. I even helped with the sheriff. Somebody, they needed to deputize somebody, go find somebody. I would help with that as well. So kind of civic-minded, if you will. Well, once Hattie died, we had, Amy and I had a good life as well. And before we were done, we left Mason City, sold our property here, and moved to Clear Lake. We had a little cottage on the lake and spent the last 20 years of my life, the rest of her life there at Clear Lake. So it was good. I enjoyed my life, and I hope that you appreciate coming to visit me. Not often we get so many visitors. But you'll see me, Jonathan, and both Mamie and Hattie here whenever you come to visit. Thanks a lot.
There'll be a lot of traffic around here today. My name is Wilson, Alonzo Wilson. I was born in 1822 back in New York State. Came out to Illinois in 37. I was 13. My father, Thomas, liked to move. We lived all over Illinois. I had a fair common education. I met Catherine, my wife, in Illinois, and we were married in 1845. I was one of the first settlers here after Owen, Anson Owen. They named the township after him. Now, I had 4 young'uns and the missus when I came out here, and we came on a prairie schooner, a Conestoga. And we started farming. We had a large farm, and it was mostly black muck, with clay and sand underlying. but it would grow anything you dropped on it. Now, I built a log cabin. It was 2 stories, the first one in Cerro Gordo County. I was the first justice of the peace, and I held several other offices. Then I began dealing in real estate and was a money lender and a broker. I used money that I got with a venture out west. I'd heard about that gold discovery and led a group of men out to California. And we thought we could earn enough money to get established in Iowa by herding cattle and taking those supplies that the miners would need. Well, that was quite the experience. We had to use mules to get those supplies up over the mountains. And that is where I got the name Yankee Wilson. Not to be confused with that rotter Chicago Wilson, that no good son of a... I didn't do nothing for nobody. But anyway, we were smart enough to take gold coins out west because out there they use wildcat red dog money that's worthless as a continental. Now, I did some ranching up in North California, Yolo County, and we did very well with those trips out west. But I wanted to get back to Iowa because the missus, she was carrying another one of her wonderful creations. She had the first child, who was a girl, and then the next was a boy, then a girl, then a boy, then a girl. It was just getting so you could bet on it. So we were expecting a boy, and then we got Gertrude instead. But she was a fair good child. Now, the land was big enough that we could hold a school on there, and it was 24 by 52 and was built in 57. And it had a second story because the church wanted to use that. And it was made out of quarry stone that we found nearby, and some of it was burnt into lime, and the lime was placed in a hole and slacked thoroughly over the winter to make mortar. Now that mortar was strong. 40 years later, when we tore that building down, that mortar was still as strong as concrete. And that school also had a Troy bell made out of Malcolm silver that was worth $200 by itself. Now, I bought some books to give to that school. The Encyclopedia Americana, Marston's History of the U.S., Aesop's Fables, Milton's Paradise Lost, Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey, some Shakespeare, Webster's Dictionary, and the Bible, of course, and some poetry by Burns, Scott, and Pope. Now, the first teacher there was Ava Prescott, and then later H.G. Parker, Mrs. Parker, the banker's wife, and then Gina, who married Ralph Stanbury. But I think the last teacher was my second child, Bruce. Now, the second floor was used by the church, and I don't know about your church, but in this one I rarely saw much levity. But I remember one Sunday morning when the Reverend H.G. Horton was preaching, and he heard some laughing and snickering going on in the back. Well, he slammed that Bible down on the pulpit, and he said, "Laugh, laugh, you deluded devils." Why, hell is so full of your kind that the legs are sticking out of the window. Well, that tirade quieted them down for a little while. But later, when the walls cracked, I bought that building and kept green. Now, I told you that I had 8 children, or at least I think I told you that. There was Alice, Bruce, Emma, and Buford, and then Mary and John, and of course Gertrude. Now, I had a lot of grandchildren, but I can't tell you how many. Catherine would try to tell me all the time, but it changed so often I lost track. And most of them were into learning and music. Now, my son John, he had a boy named Meredith, or Meredith. And that boy was given a piccolo. And he would not stop blowing that thing. I tried to hide it from him, but you know, he was just too smart for me. And now I hear he's even writing music. Well, his mother, Rosalie, tried to keep an eye on him, but she was so busy up at the Congregational Church up north, she taught Sunday school. Well, I think I've probably bored you long enough. I want to thank you for paying such good attention, except for that woman back there that kept laughing and snickering. I hope you have a good day.